On a quiet morning in a small Ohio town, a weary veteran handed over his last $600 for a rusted 1967 Chevrolet, abandoned in a dusty barn. Why would a man with nothing left gamble everything on a car that hadn't run in decades? What John Miller and his loyal dog Max uncovered inside that wreck was more than rust and steel. It was a soldier's unfinished dream, a hidden legacy, and a second chance waiting to be reborn. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of veterans, loyalty, and redemption. The morning sky above the Ohio Valley was overcast, painted in muted tones of gray and silver. A chill wind rustled through the branches of bare maples, sending last year's brittle leaves skittering across the quiet main road of the small town. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, damp soil, and the metallic tang of distant rain. It was not yet spring, and everything carried the sense of waiting for warmth, for color, for life to return. John Miller walked slowly along the cracked sidewalk leading out toward the edge of town, his boots scuffing against loose gravel. He was 47 years old, his body still broad-shouldered and strong from decades of military service, yet worn down by time and memory. His hair was hazel brown, cut short in a utilitarian style, with strands of silver threading through at the temples. A thin, uneven beard with more silver than brown traced his jaw, lending him a rugged, almost severe look. His eyes, deep-set and steel blue, carried the weary intensity of a man who had seen too much. They scanned the horizon as if expecting danger, though the only movement came from the occasional sparrow darting from the eaves of an abandoned store. John's hands, scarred and calloused, looked like they had never stopped working. They had wielded rifles, patched broken machinery, and dug trenches in foreign deserts. Now they hung heavy at his sides, restless and searching for purpose. His back was straight, his gait deliberate, but something in the way his shoulders hunched forward betrayed a constant weight he could not set down. Beside him trotted Max, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat of deep browns and blacks that gleamed under the muted light. Max was muscular but lean, his posture proud, ears pricked forward as if forever on duty. The dog's amber eyes often darted to John, scanning his master's face, attuned to every subtle shift of mood. To outsiders, Max might have looked simply like a handsome, disciplined companion, but to John he was far more, a silent comrade, the only one who had followed him home from battle. Max had been trained as a K-9 in his earlier years, though never deployed overseas. He bore the bearing of discipline nonetheless, steady on command, patient in waiting, fierce if provoked. Yet, with John, his nature softened. He had the uncanny habit of pressing his head against John's knee when the nightmares returned, as if pinning him back into the world of the living. In those long nights when memories of blood and fire returned unbidden, Max's steady breath and quiet weight against his side had kept John tethered. Without the dog, there were nights he doubted he would have survived himself. The town of Glenfield was small, its few streets lined with shuttered shops and old houses in varying states of repair. Once, it had bustled with families and industry, but years of economic decline had stripped it bare. John had grown up not far from here, running through fields as a boy, his father's calloused hand guiding him to church on Sundays. That life seemed a century ago. He had left as a young soldier, full of purpose, and returned decades later to find both himself and the town altered beyond recognition. His home now was a weather-beaten wooden cabin on the outskirts, a structure that leaned slightly to one side, as though mirroring its owner's fatigue. The roof carried moss in patches, the windows clouded from years of dust, the porch steps sagging. Inside, it was spare, just a bed, a table, a chair, and the essentials John had carried with him from post to post. A photograph of his unit, faded and creased, sat in a cracked frame on the mantel. He rarely looked at it, but he could never bring himself to put it away. Each morning followed a ritual. John would rise before dawn, haunted from dreams, and walk Max through the empty fields behind the cabin. The air was often cold enough to sting his lungs, but the silence gave him space to breathe. Later he would make weak coffee on the old percolator and set out to town in search of odd jobs, fixing fences, patching roofs, hauling lumber. His hands still knew how to work, and though the pay was meager, the labor steadied him. Neighbors knew him as polite but distant. He rarely joined in conversations longer than a greeting, and when someone pressed him about his past, his jaw would tighten, his eyes slipping away. There had been a time he might have opened up, but too many memories now crowded his mind like ghosts. Once, at the diner, a man had asked lightly, "So, did you see the action overseas?" John had frozen, fork in midair, his breathing shallow, until Max nudged his leg under the table. He muttered a reply and left, unable to stop the shaking in his hands for hours after. PTSD was a shadow he carried everywhere, invisible to those who had never lived its weight. Max was his shield in those moments. The dog's presence created a barrier between him and the world. People noticed and learned quickly. If you wanted to speak to John Miller, best to greet Max first. Children especially adored the German Shepherd, and though John often felt awkward with their innocent questions, Max handled them with calm dignity. He would sit still as tiny hands patted his coat, eyes warm and patient. John sometimes wondered if Max understood more about healing than he ever could. One rainy afternoon, John found himself repairing the roof of Sarah Collins, an older widow who lived alone at the edge of town. Sarah was tall and lean, her frame wiry from years of tending a small farm by herself. Her hair, once auburn, was streaked with gray and tied in a practical bun at the nape of her neck. Her skin was weathered from sun and wind, her hands calloused from daily labor. She spoke with a blunt kindness, her voice carrying the steadiness of someone who had endured her share of hardship. Sarah had lost her husband in a mill accident years ago, and since then, she had survived by sheer determination. She knew how to stretch a dollar, how to fix broken tools with nothing but wire and patience, and how to keep her dignity in the face of loss. When she watched John hammer shingles into place, she studied him with the quiet understanding of one scarred by life. She offered him tea afterward, and though John hesitated, Max trotted eagerly to the porch, tail swaying, nudging his master inside. Sitting in Sarah's kitchen, John felt the strangeness of warmth he had long denied himself. The room smelled of herbs and bread, the walls lined with mismatched crockery, everything carrying the marks of care. Sarah poured tea into chipped mugs, her eyes soft but direct. "You're a man carrying something heavy," she said gently. John shifted uncomfortably, staring into the steam. Max lay at his feet, chin resting on his boots, a living anchor. John did not answer. He didn't know how. But something in Sarah's tone lingered after he left, as if she had seen beneath the armor he wore. That night, as the wind howled outside his cabin, John sat at the small table with Max at his side. The dog's steady breath filled the silence, grounding him. He stared at the photo on the mantel, at faces long gone, and whispered, "I'm still here, but I don't know what for." His voice cracked, the sound raw against the stillness. Max lifted his head, amber eyes meeting his master's. No words were needed. John reached down, fingers brushing the coarse fur, and for the first time in years allowed himself to lean into the warmth of another living soul. The storm outside raged, but inside, a fragile thread of hope began to stir. The morning after the storm had cleared, Glenfield awoke beneath a sky of pale blue. Thin streaks of cloud stretched across the horizon, and the damp earth smelled of renewal. John Miller rose early, his sleep shallow, but steadied by Max's presence curled at the foot of the bed. He fed the dog, poured himself bitter coffee, and walked into town with his jacket pulled against the lingering chill. His days usually revolved around seeking work, repairing fences, stacking firewood, hauling supplies for the aging shopkeepers. But that morning, something shifted, though he could not have named it then. It was outside Martin's Hardware that John met Paul Jenkins. Paul was a local mechanic in his mid-50s, with a heavy frame that had once been muscular but now sagged under the weight of years. His skin was ruddy from long days outdoors, and a salt and pepper beard covered most of his broad face. His eyes, however, carried a sharp humor, often undercut by a streak of bitterness born of disappointment. Paul had once run a modest garage on the edge of town, but after a fire and poor insurance, he never rebuilt. Now he scraped by, fixing farm machinery and reselling old tools. He greeted John with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, vet," Paul said, his voice gravelly from cigarettes. He slapped his grease-stained hands against his thighs. "You still looking for work, or maybe something more to keep those hands busy?" John raised a brow, cautious. Max stood close, ears slightly tilted as though evaluating Paul himself. "What are you getting at?" John asked. Paul leaned closer, lowering his voice, though no one lingered nearby. "There's a Chevy out west of town, 67, sitting in old Harrington's barn for years. Rusted to hell, sure, but it's all there. Guy's desperate to clear space. He said he'd let it go for 600 cash. Says it's eating up half his barn." The words stirred something deep inside John, though he kept his face still. A 1967 Chevrolet. Classic, once powerful, once proud. Not a pretty car now, no doubt, but a machine that could be coaxed back to life. He thought of his empty nights, of Sarah's quiet words about carrying something heavy. Perhaps he needed something heavy to carry that wasn't grief. Paul shrugged. "Not saying it'll run. Might just be a pile of steel with no soul left. But I know you. You've got patience. And that dog of yours looks like he'd stand guard over you no matter how long it takes." Later that day, John walked the dirt road to the Harrington farm. The land stretched wide, dotted with skeletal corn stalks from last season. The barn loomed ahead, weathered wood sagging, its red paint long faded to brown. Frank Harrington, the owner, emerged from the shadows of the doorway. Frank was in his 60s, tall but stooped, with narrow shoulders and a lined, leathery face. His gray hair stuck out from under a cap, and his hands, large and rough, betrayed a lifetime of hard labor. He spoke little, each word clipped, as though conserving energy. "You here for the Chevy?" Frank asked, squinting. John nodded, adjusting his stance. "I was told it's still in there." Frank gestured toward the barn. "Been sitting 20 years, tires rotted, engines seized, 600 cash, and she's yours. No haggling. Truth is, I just need it gone before the roof caves in on it." Inside, the barn smelled of dust, hay, and rust. Shafts of sunlight pierced through holes in the roof, illuminating floating moats. Under a heavy canvas tarp sat the Chevrolet, its outline still noble despite decay. Frank grasped one corner of the tarp and pulled. The fabric slid back with a groan, revealing the left fender, dulled chrome grille, and paint once bright red, now chalky and scarred with rust at the seams. John stepped closer, running his calloused hand across the oxidized surface. He saw beyond the decay. He saw possibility, memory, a story waiting. Max padded beside him, sniffing at the tires, ears pricked, tail steady. The dog seemed to sense John's hesitation, then looked up with a sharp bark, as though declaring approval. John hesitated. $600 was nearly all he had. Money meant for food, for rent, for the slow grind of survival. But survival was not enough anymore. He thought of the photo on his mantle, of empty nights gnawed by silence, of Sarah's words about carrying weight. His heart thudded. Perhaps this was not a gamble, but a lifeline. He pulled the envelope of bills from his jacket and handed it over. "I'll take it." Frank nodded once, without ceremony, and tucked the money away. "Truck will be here tomorrow to drop it at your place. After that, it's your problem." He offered his hand. John shook it, firm grip to firm grip, sealing the deal. The next day, when the flatbed truck rumbled into his yard, Max barked once, sharp and eager. The driver, a lanky young man named Tommy, hopped down from the cab. Tommy was in his early 20s with long limbs and a shock of blonde hair that stuck out under his cap. His face was freckled, his expression cheerful but harried, the kind of boy who worked too many jobs for too little pay. He greeted John with an easy grin. "Got your Chevy here, sir," Tommy said, wiping grease on his jeans. "She's heavy, but she's got character. I'll give her that. I've seen you and that dog walking through town. Figured if anyone's stubborn enough to bring her back, it's you two." John watched as the flatbed tilted, easing the battered car into the center of his yard. The sun caught the oxidized paint, making it flare dull red. The cracked windshield caught the light like lightning. Max paced around it, nose twitching, tail swaying with curiosity. Tommy gave a low whistle. "You're gonna need patience for this one, but if anyone can do it, looks like you can." He tipped his cap and drove off, leaving, and silence and the car in John's care. John stood for a long while, staring at the Chevrolet. His reflection shimmered faintly in the dull chrome, warped and blurred. He felt the familiar weight pressing down, doubts, fears, memories. But Max pressed against his leg, warm and steady. John laid a hand on the dog's head, then on the hood of the car. "It's just you and me, Max," he whispered. Let's see if we can bring her back." The sun rose pale and hesitant over Glenfield, casting weak rays through thin clouds that clung stubbornly to the horizon. John Miller stood in his yard, with Max at his side, staring at the Chevrolet. The car sat in silence, paint faded and chalky, its once proud form bowed under years of neglect. The early light caught the dew clinging to the rusted seams, making them glisten, as if the car itself wept for the years wasted. John's breath misted in the chill, and he rubbed his palms together before setting to work. He began by clearing the interior. The driver's door creaked open with a protesting groan. The smell hit him first: dust, mildew, and the faint acrid tang of mice nests long abandoned. The seat cushions were torn, foam spilling like wounded flesh. Springs squeaked under his weight as he leaned in, pulling out debris with methodical determination. Max lingered at the doorway, head tilted, amber eyes scanning his master's movements, tail swishing gently in the dirt. John removed the glove box, finding nothing but a brittle cigarette stub and a warped pen. He sighed, half expecting the emptiness. Yet, something in him pushed forward. Piece by piece, he stripped out the carpeting, rolling it back to reveal a floor pan scarred by rust, but still intact. Beneath one section, he noticed a corner of metal bent oddly, almost as if pried before. He tapped it with a screwdriver, but it yielded no secret. He pressed on. By mid-morning, sweat had dampened his beige shirt, clinging to his back despite the cold air. He paused only when Sarah Collins appeared at the edge of his yard, her tall figure framed by the fence line. She carried a basket of bread wrapped in cloth, her gray-streaked auburn hair catching stray beams of sun. "You'll work yourself into the ground before you ever get that thing running," she said, her voice warm but teasing. John straightened, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Good morning to you, too." His tone was gruff, but softened by the faintest curve of a smile. Max trotted toward Sarah, tail wagging as though welcoming an old friend. She bent to scratch behind his ears before handing the basket to John. "I thought you might forget to eat," she said. "Men like you sometimes need reminding." John accepted the bread with a stiff nod. "Thank you." Their eyes met briefly, her gaze steady and knowing, his uneasy but grateful. Before she left, Sarah rested her hand on the fence. "Whatever you find in that car, John, don't be afraid to let it mean something." With that, she walked back toward her farmhouse, leaving her words hanging in the crisp air. John returned to the Chevy, her statement gnawing at him. He moved to the trunk, fumbling with the rusted lock until it gave way with a harsh snap. The trunk lid lifted reluctantly, hinges squealing in protest. Inside lay a jumble of decayed fabric, a shredded spare tire, and, at the back corner, a small wooden box, edges worn smooth with time. His breath caught. He pulled it out gently, dust puffing into the air as Max nosed closer, sniffing with keen curiosity. The box was plain, unmarked, yet heavy with the weight of memory. John sat on the stoop of his cabin. Max pressed close and opened the box. Inside were several faded photographs. The first showed a young man, barely 17, standing proudly beside the same Chevrolet, its paint fresh, his hands stained with grease. His grin was wide, hopeful, his hair shaggy beneath the sun. The second photo captured him holding a wrench, crouched by the hood with another figure, an older man, perhaps a father, both mid-laugh, frozen in time. John studied the faces, unfamiliar yet achingly familiar in their youthful certainty. Beneath the photos lay scraps of paper, notes scrawled in uneven handwriting. New carb, need gasket, one read. Another listed parts prices, circled with frustration. A final note simply said, "One day she'll run again. Don't quit." The ink had blurred from age, but the intent rang clear. John's throat tightened. He ran a rough thumb across the face of the boy in the first photo, and in that moment, it felt like he was staring into his own past. He remembered himself at that age, broad-shouldered but reckless, dreaming of freedom, eager to escape small-town limits. He remembered enlisting with fire in his chest, convinced war would carve him into someone strong, someone needed. But war had stripped dreams, not built them. That boy in the photo had wanted to restore a car. John's boyhood self had wanted to restore meaning. Neither had finished what they started. Max pressed his nose against the box, a gentle nudge as if urging John not to drift too far into memory. John chuckled hoarsely, rubbing the dog's ears. "You're right, boy. No use getting lost. Maybe it's our turn now." By late afternoon, he had carefully pinned the photographs to his toolboard inside the garage. The scraps of notes fluttered slightly in the draft, whispering reminders. As he worked on removing the seats, tightening bolts, and scraping rust, he found himself muttering softly, as if speaking to the unknown boy who once dreamed. The rhythm of work steadied him, yet shadows of memory crept at the edges. Once, when he dropped a wrench, the clang echoed too sharply, pulling him back to desert barracks and sudden alarms. His breath came fast, his hands shaking, until Max leapt up, pressing against him. The dog's weight anchored him, the warmth of fur grounding him. Slowly, John exhaled, his chest easing. He scratched Max's neck. "Not alone," he whispered. As the light faded, he stepped back to survey the stripped interior, the trunk empty, but for echoes of its past. The car was no longer just rust and steel. It was a vessel, a conversation across time. Somewhere, a young man had poured hope into this machine and left it unfinished. Now, John felt compelled to carry it forward, not for glory, not for money, but because leaving it to rot felt like abandoning himself all over again. That night, sitting by the table with the wooden box beside his coffee mug, John allowed himself a thought he hadn't voiced in years. Maybe there is still something worth building. Max lay at his feet, his eyes half closed but ears twitching, as though he too listened for the answer. The mornings grew longer as spring pushed its way into Glenfield, but for John Miller, the days blended into one another in a haze of rust, oil, and fatigue. The Chevrolet sat in the center of his garage like a wounded beast, its frame corroded, engine seized into silence. Every bolt John tried to loosen fought back against him. Every piece of metal seemed determined to remain broken. His calloused hands cracked from the cold steel and solvent, his fingernails dark with grease that soap could never quite erase. Still, he pressed on. The engine was his first great trial. When John finally pulled the block from its bed, he discovered it was beyond simple repair. The pistons were locked in place, and the crankshaft refused to turn, despite hours of coaxing with oil and tools. He leaned against the workbench, sweat rolling down his temples, his chest heaving with the same frustration that once haunted him in war zones when nothing went according to plan. He thought of giving up, yet Max pressed against his leg with quiet insistence, amber eyes steady. But there was a cost. Replacement parts weren't cheap, and John's pockets were thin. He sold his father's old hunting rifle, a piece he had kept locked away for years, never able to part with it until necessity demanded. He sold an antique clock his mother once polished weekly, its ticking long silenced, but memory still alive in its frame. Piece by piece, he stripped away fragments of his past to purchase the bolts, gaskets, and panels needed to give the Chevrolet a chance. Each sacrifice weighed heavily, but he told himself that what he was building now was worth more than relics that only reminded him of loss. Some evenings he staggered out of the garage so exhausted he could barely stand. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and his vision blurred with the onset of migraines. On one particularly brutal night, he collapsed onto the concrete floor beside the half-stripped car. The chill seeped into his bones, and the flashbacks struck like artillery. Screams, sandstorms, and the crack of gunfire filled his mind. His breath came ragged, eyes wide in panic though the garage was silent. Max's bark shattered the spiral. The dog darted out through the half-open door, paws pounding against the ground, barking with such urgency that it startled Sarah Collins awake in her farmhouse. Sarah threw on a shawl over her long frame and rushed toward John's cabin, her bun loosening as she ran. By the time she arrived, lantern in hand, Max was pacing frantically by the garage entrance. She pushed the door open to find John unconscious, sprawled on the floor, skin pale with sweat. With surprising strength for her wiry build, Sarah knelt and shook him gently. Her weathered face tightened with worry, lines deepening around her gray eyes. "John," she called firmly, her voice both commanding and kind. When he groaned and stirred, she exhaled relief. Together they managed to get him onto a chair. She pressed a cloth to his forehead, steadying him until his breathing eased. "You can't drive yourself like this," she scolded softly, though her tone carried more concern than anger. A man's body can only take so much, no matter how strong. John rubbed his temples, ashamed. I thought I could push through. Sarah's gaze softened. Everyone thinks that, until they break. Don't make Max carry your burdens alone. Max sat at John's feet, chest rising and falling with relief, as if he too understood the gravity of what had nearly happened. John placed a shaky hand on the dog's head. He saved me, he whispered, voice raw. Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening. Yes, but he shouldn't have to do it again. Word of the incident spread quietly through the small town. Soon neighbors began to take notice. One evening, while John worked on sanding down the rusted panels, Pete Armstrong stopped by. Pete was in his late 40s, a stocky man with broad shoulders and a round belly that betrayed years behind the counter of the general store. His face was clean-shaven, ruddy, with a habit of smiling even when he carried bad news. Pete had lost his younger brother in the same conflict John had served, and though grief had long settled, it shaped his compassion toward veterans. "You need anything, John?" Pete asked, leaning against the doorframe with his familiar, easy grin. "I've got some spare steel wool, maybe a few clamps you could use. Don't cost a dime." John hesitated but nodded. "I'll take them, thank you." Pete shrugged. "You'd do the same for me." His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered with unspoken understanding. Others followed in small gestures. Mrs. Avery, Sarah's old neighbor, left jars of stew on his porch, muttering about keeping men from falling over dead. A retired machinist named George Whitman offered to help drill new mounts for the suspension. George was a tall, stooped figure in his 70s, his once black hair gone white, his cheeks hollow, but his hands still steady. He had worked for decades in a factory before it shut down, leaving him with more knowledge than purpose. Helping John seemed to revive something in him. "Metal bends if you know where to press," he said with a faint smile, guiding John's grip on a tool. Still, the days were grueling. John fought battles in silence every night, waking in cold sweats, his shirt plastered to his skin, Max's muzzle nudging him back to reality. He doubted himself often, staring at the Chevy's frame and wondering if he was chasing a ghost. Yet, each morning, he rose again, driven by the memory of the boy in the faded photograph, and by the weight of Max's steady gaze. Late one night, as the crickets sang beyond the cabin walls, John sat in the driver's seat of the gutted car, hands gripping the wheel, though it was cracked and lifeless. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine what it would feel like to turn the key and hear the engine roar to life. A tear traced down his cheek before he even realized it. "We'll get there, Max," he whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. "Even if it breaks me." Max shifted beside him, head resting on his lap, eyes closing in quiet trust. In the weeks that followed his collapse, John Miller's garage became both a battlefield and a beacon. Each day he rose before dawn, shoulders stiff, fingers raw, and set to work on the rusted Chevrolet. The car still resisted him, its bolts stripped, its frame warped, its engine a stubborn corpse. But John no longer fought alone. Word of his struggle had drifted beyond whispers. Some in Glenfield still muttered that he was just the old vet wasting time on junk, but others began to watch him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. It was Max who changed everything. One bright afternoon, as spring truly settled over the town, a child's cry echoed from the road beyond John's cabin. 8-year-old Danny Clark, a freckle-faced boy with untidy blonde hair and wiry limbs, had ridden his bicycle too fast down the sloping dirt path. The chain snapped, the wheels locked, and the boy was thrown beneath the frame, his leg pinned awkwardly. John heard the cry and rushed out, but Max was faster, bounding down the path, barking sharply. The dog reached Danny, tugging the bicycle just enough for John to lift it clear. The boy sobbed, scraped but not broken, clinging to Max's neck. Mrs. Clark, Danny's mother, arrived breathless moments later. She was a stout woman in her late 30s, her brown hair tied back hastily, her apron still dusted with flour from baking. Tears streaked her cheeks as she gathered her son, whispering gratitude, but her gaze lingered on John, then Max. "We thought you were just hiding away," she admitted, voice trembling. "But you saved my boy, both of you." The story spread quickly. In a town as small as Glenfield, news carried faster than the wind. Suddenly John was no longer just the scarred man tinkering with rust. He was the veteran whose loyal dog had saved a child. People began stopping by his cabin, some out of thanks, some out of curiosity, some with parts in hand. One evening, Pete Armstrong returned, his stocky frame leaning against the garage door as John worked. "Got something for you," Pete said, lifting a cardboard box. Inside lay a set of carburetor parts, old but usable. "Been sitting in my store's attic for years. Figured you'd give them better purpose than dust." His ruddy face broke into a smile. "Besides, I owe you a drink for what you and Max did for that boy." Later that week, Sarah Collins brought a basket of sweet rolls. Her tall figure filled the doorway, her hair pulled back, but loose strands catching the light. "Thought you could use something warm," she said. Her eyes softened as she looked at the stripped Chevrolet. "You're not just fixing steel, John. You're reminding people what perseverance looks like." John had no words for that, but the warmth in his chest told him she was right. Others followed. George Whitman, the retired machinist, arrived with his tools more often, showing John tricks to salvage warped metal. "Press slow, not hard," George explained, his bony hands guiding John's grip. Despite his age, George's eyes lit up with something close to joy each time he bent steel back into shape. Even newcomers joined in. Miguel Ramirez, a wiry man in his late 20s with dark hair and a thick accent, had recently moved to Glenfield with his young family. A former auto body worker from Texas, Miguel had been struggling to find steady employment. When he heard about John's project, he appeared one morning at the garage. His skin was sun-browned, his hands scarred from years of welding, his eyes tired but eager. "I don't have money to give," he said shyly, "but I can sand panels, patch frames, if you let me." John studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Grab a mask, let's work." Soon, what had once been John's solitary refuge became a place of gathering. Neighbors brought old parts, tools, and food. Children lingered at the edges, watching Max with wide eyes, daring to pet him when John gave permission. The German Shepherd accepted their touches calmly, tail wagging, his proud stance softening into gentle patience. For the first time, laughter returned to the garage. At night, when John sat at his table, he thought of the boy in the faded photograph found in the trunk. That boy's dream had been left unfinished, but here in Glenfield, piece by piece, strangers were breathing life back into it. John realized he was no longer carrying the weight alone. The car had become more than steel and rust. It was a mirror for the town itself, a symbol of resilience. Still, there were hard days. PTSD lingered, ambushing him when the clang of metal echoed too sharply, or when the smell of oil transported him back to dusty convoys. In those moments, Max pressed close, Sarah sometimes steadying him with her quiet words, George or Miguel quietly giving him space until he found his ground. They didn't judge, they simply stayed. That, John thought, was the greatest gift. By the end of spring, the garage no longer looked abandoned. Tools lined the walls, parts stacked neatly, the Chevrolet lifted on blocks with its panels sanded clean. It was still far from whole, but the change was undeniable. Glenfield began to whisper differently, no longer about the old vet wasting time, but about the man building something from nothing. The late afternoon sun slanted through the open garage door, painting long golden stripes across the concrete. Dust swirled in the beams of light as John Miller crouched inside the gutted Chevrolet, sweat dampening the collar of his beige shirt. The smell of rust, oil, and worn fabric clung to the air, a constant companion in his long days of labor. Max lay nearby, ears alert even in rest, his sable coat glowing under the muted light. John muttered to himself as he wrestled with the driver's seat, its bolts refusing to yield. With a final grunt and twist, the frame gave way, the seat sliding forward with a screech. As John dragged it clear, he noticed something odd, a section of the seat base that felt heavier than it should, the leather padding stitched over a slight hollow. His mechanic's instinct sharpened. Running his fingers along the underside, he found the edge of a concealed compartment, cleverly tucked where casual eyes would never look. His heart quickened. He took his screwdriver and pried it open carefully. Inside, wrapped in yellowing cloth, lay 3 objects: a tarnished military badge, a small St. Christopher pendant strung on a silver chain, and a check folded with careful precision, the ink faint but legible. "For the day she runs again." The name scrawled across the corner was unfamiliar, but the handwriting was steady, purposeful. John's breath caught. He sat heavily on the garage floor, the items trembling in his rough palms. He knew the weight of tokens like these. A soldier's badge was not just metal, it carried blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The pendant, worn smooth from years against a chest, was the mark of someone who had sought protection in the darkest of nights. And the check, uncashed, represented a dream deferred, left waiting for hands that never returned. For a long moment, the garage was silent, save for the hum of the evening cicadas. John's eyes burned as he stared at the relics. "He was one of us," John whispered hoarsely. Memories surged, faces of brothers in arms who never made it home, laughter around campfires that ended in silence, promises spoken and broken by war. His hands shook, and for a moment, he could not breathe. Max rose and pressed his head against John's knee, grounding him. Sarah Collins appeared at the doorway just then, her tall frame framed by the dying light. She carried a bundle of fresh linens, her auburn hair pulled back, but wisps falling against her weathered face. She saw John hunched over, shoulders trembling. Concern tightened her expression. "John, what is it?" Wordlessly, John held up the objects. Sarah stepped closer, her long fingers brushing over the pendant before pulling back as though it were sacred. Her gray eyes softened, a mix of sorrow and reverence. "Someone left pieces of their soul in this car," she murmured. John nodded, swallowing hard. "A soldier, like me. He never finished this dream. He meant to. He left money to see it through, but—" his voice cracked. "He didn't come home." Sarah rested a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch steady, anchoring. "Then maybe it was meant for you to finish it. Maybe that's why you found it." John looked at her, eyes glistening. "I can't let this die. This isn't just steel anymore. It's a promise I'll keep, even if it kills me." Sarah's voice was low but firm. "It won't kill you, John. Not if you let others carry the weight with you." Her gaze shifted to Max, who stood watchful, ears perked as though he understood every word. Later that night, John pinned the badge to the toolboard, hung the pendant beside the faded photographs, and placed the check in a small jar for safekeeping. The garage felt different now, haunted yet holy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the soldier's unfinished vow. When Miguel Ramirez stopped by the next day, his sun-browned face slick with sweat from a roofing job, John showed him the discovery. Miguel crossed himself quickly, his dark eyes wide. "Senor, this car, it's not just yours anymore. It belongs to all of us now." George Whitman, the stooped machinist, studied the badge in silence when he came later. His lined face, usually calm, tightened with grief. "I've seen too many like him," George muttered, voice gravelly. "Boys with dreams bigger than their years. If you finish this car, you'll be finishing it for all of them." Even Pete Armstrong, the jovial shopkeeper, grew solemn when John shared the secret. He rubbed his chin, his ruddy face unusually still. "My brother left pieces like that behind. Never thought they'd matter to anyone else, but they do." The discovery breathed new life into the project. The townsfolk who had already trickled in with food, tools, or parts now came with renewed urgency. A man named Harold Briggs, broad-shouldered and gruff, once known for avoiding sentiment, arrived with a box of old wrenches. His dark hair was streaked with gray, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his voice low as he said, "He might have been my buddy, or yours. Either way, I'll help." The garage became a shrine as much as a workshop. Children who played outside were hushed when they entered, their wide eyes settling on the pendant and the photos pinned to the wall. To them, it was as if ghosts whispered through the rust and chrome, asking for completion. Max patrolled the space like a guardian, lying near the badge, tail thumping when visitors approached with respect. But John carried the heaviest burden. At night, the objects in the jar seemed to glow in his mind's eye. He would lie awake, memories crashing like waves, comrades falling beside him, the helplessness of not being able to save them all. The car had become a channel for his grief, but also his redemption. He whispered to Max in the darkness, his hand resting on the dog's sturdy frame. "We'll do it, boy. We'll make her run again. Not just for us, for him, for all of them." The dog's amber eyes gleamed in the dim light, steady and sure. The morning dawned cold and bright, a thin layer of frost dusting the windows of John's garage. The air inside smelled of oil, paint, and steel, a perfume of effort that had seeped into every corner after months of endless work. The Chevrolet stood in the center bay, no longer the husk of rust he had dragged home, but a gleaming machine reborn in fire-red paint that caught and bent the light into dazzling reflections. Chrome gleamed, panels aligned flush, and the car looked ready to run. But everyone in the garage knew the truth. Until the engine fired, it was only a statue of promise. John Miller wiped his hands on a rag, his palms slick with sweat despite the chill. His hazel-brown hair was mussed, streaks of silver at his beard catching the light, making him look older than his 47 years. His shoulders sagged under the weight of sleepless nights, scraped knuckles, and the ghosts that never left him. He glanced at Max, the German shepherd whose steady gaze had carried him through more than one dark night. The dog stood poised at his side, tail still, ears pricked forward. Around them, the little garage was crowded with townsfolk. Sarah Collins stood near the tool bench, arms crossed, tall frame tense, auburn hair catching golden light. Her sharp gray eyes watched every move with quiet prayer. Miguel Ramirez leaned against the doorframe, dust still clinging to his worn jeans from a morning roofing job, his weathered face solemn. George Whitman, stooped but sharp-eyed, sat on a stool with his machinist's hands folded like he was in church. Even Pete Armstrong, usually quick with a joke, stood silent, lips pressed thin. Harold Briggs hovered near the back, his broad shoulders stiff, jaw clenched as though he was about to face a firing squad. The weight of expectation pressed in. Months of effort, all the bolts turned, all the money scraped together, all the prayers whispered in exhaustion, balanced on this single moment. John slid into the driver's seat. The leather was stiff and smelled faintly of new upholstery mixed with old ghosts. His hand shook as he slipped the worn key into the ignition. The St. Christopher pendant glinted where it hung from the rearview mirror, a reminder of the soldier who had once dreamed of this same moment. John twisted the key. The engine coughed, a harsh metallic gasp, then silence. His chest tightened. He tried again. The starter groaned, then gave a hollow rattle, threatening to choke. A murmur rippled through the garage. John's throat went dry. He pressed his forehead to the steering wheel, his breath ragged. "Not now," he whispered. "Don't fail me now." Max barked, sharp and commanding, his paws tapping the concrete. The sound startled everyone, cutting through the despair. John lifted his head. The dog's amber eyes locked on his, fierce and unwavering. In that gaze, John saw every night Max had stood guard when his nightmares left him gasping. He saw loyalty that never faltered, love that never asked why. The dog seemed to say, "Do it again. Do not quit." John exhaled, straightened, and gripped the key tighter. His voice trembled but firmed as he spoke aloud. "All right, one more time, for him, for all of us." He turned the key. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a low rumble, uneven and struggling, filled the garage. The car shuddered like a chest taking its first breath. John's heart pounded. He pressed the accelerator gently. The rumble deepened, steadied, then suddenly roared. The V8 engine came alive, thundering with a sound that rattled tools on the walls and sent vibrations through the floor. The garage exploded in shouts and laughter. Sarah clapped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Miguel let out a cheer, his deep voice booming, "She lives!" George laughed hoarsely, slapping his knee, his old eyes alight like a boy's. Pete whooped, and Harold Briggs gave a rare grin, his stern face breaking into something brighter. John sat frozen in the driver's seat, eyes wide, throat tight with something between a sob and a laugh. The engine purred now, steady and strong, like a heart that had waited too long but finally found its rhythm. He reached down and stroked Max's head, the dog pressing close, ears still perked, tail wagging for the first time that day. "We did it, boy," John whispered. "We really did it." Outside, the sound of the engine carried through the streets of the small town, drawing people from their houses and shops. They came, curious and smiling, gathering at the garage door. Some clapped, others simply listened, the rumble resonating like a hymn. Children pointed at the gleaming car, wide-eyed, while the older folk nodded, remembering their own youth, their own roads. John stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the concrete. His face was streaked with grease, his eyes red, but his smile was wide and unashamed. He lifted his hands, palms open, as if to say the miracle was not his alone, but theirs, the town's, the soldiers', and every broken dream stitched together by stubborn hope. Max barked again, joyous this time, circling John, his sable coat gleaming in the light. The dog leapt up briefly, resting paws on John's chest, as if to claim the victory too. The crowd laughed and applauded, their joy mingling with the echo of the engine. For the first time in years, John felt whole, not just a veteran patched together by scars and survival, not just a man scraping by. He felt like a builder again, a keeper of promises, a man who had refused to give in when despair whispered that he should. The Chevrolet gleamed, alive, no longer a relic of rust, but a reborn spirit. And in its roar, John heard more than steel. He heard redemption. The late afternoon sun spilled amber light over the quiet streets of Glenfield, gilding the rooftops and painting the world in shades of fire and gold. The Chevrolet gleamed brighter than ever beneath the glow, its red bodywork polished into a mirror that reflected both the past and the future. The rumble of its engine echoed steadily, like the beat of a heart finally freed. Behind the wheel sat John Miller, his broad shoulders squared, hazel-brown hair tousled by the open window, the thin silver-streaked beard catching the light. At his side, Max rested in the passenger seat, ears perked, tongue lolling happily as the wind tugged through his sable coat. As the car rolled through Main Street, people poured out of shops and porches. Sarah Collins stood outside the bakery, her tall, slender frame wrapped in a plain cardigan, auburn hair shining in the fading light. She raised one hand, eyes glistening, and John gave her a small nod in return. Miguel Ramirez leaned against his truck, wiping grit from his palms, his sun-browned face breaking into a wide grin as he whistled in approval. George Whitman, cane in hand, stood straighter than he had in years, pride flashing across his lined features. Pete Armstrong jogged along the sidewalk, waving with both hands, his usual booming laugh carrying above the hum of the crowd. Children followed, their shouts high and joyful, pointing at the shining car as though it were a parade float. The Chevrolet was no longer just a car. It was a symbol, the town's testament that broken things could be made whole again. People clapped, waved, and called John's name, but he kept his eyes ahead, a quiet smile tugging at his mouth. Inside, he felt something he hadn't in years: belonging. Weeks later, the garage was busier than ever. John had transformed it from a solitary workshop into something alive. A battered chalkboard now leaned against the front wall, scrawled with a new name, Miller's Trade School. Teenagers who once drifted aimlessly now filed in with toolboxes and questions. Among them was Tommy Harris, a wiry 16-year-old with freckles scattered across his pale skin and restless blue eyes that betrayed both eagerness and insecurity. He had grown up with little direction, his father gone and his mother struggling to provide, but his hands proved quick and steady with a wrench. Another was Raymond Ray Porter, a fellow veteran in his early 50s, shoulders still broad, but his limp betraying an old war wound. His salt and pepper hair was cropped close, his voice gravelly and his temper short, but beneath his roughness was a man who longed for purpose. John welcomed him into the fold, recognizing the shadows in Ray's gaze as ones he knew too well. Together, they began teaching side by side, guiding the younger ones not just in mechanics, but in discipline and self-worth. Sarah stopped by often, bringing fresh bread or coffee, sometimes rolling up her sleeves to help sand a panel or organize bolts. She laughed more freely now, the hardness in her gray eyes softening each time she glanced at John. Miguel lent his skills too, teaching welding techniques to eager apprentices. Even Father Kent, the town preacher, continued his visits, speaking about patience and faith as he helped polish chrome until it gleamed. And always, Max was there. The German Shepherd patrolled the shop floor like a quiet sentinel, nosing at apprentices when they dropped tools, sitting beside nervous veterans during their first nights back, and trotting faithfully at John's heels. The townsfolk began calling him the guardian of the garage, and children adored him, scratching behind his ears and laughing when his tail swept the floor like a broom. Still, not every day was easy. There were setbacks, engines that seized, apprentices who gave up after one hard night, and veterans who walked away, unable to face their ghosts. On those evenings, John would sit at his workbench long after the others had gone, staring at the St. Christopher medal that hung from the rearview mirror of the Chevy. He would stroke Max's fur and remind himself aloud, "We don't quit, boy. Not now, not ever. The Chevrolet became more than just a centerpiece. It was a classroom. John showed the apprentices its engine, teaching them how to read the blueprints Caleb had once drafted, how to blend precision with intuition. Ray found healing in explaining the finer points of brake tuning, his rough voice softening as younger ears listened with respect. Tommy, under John's patient eye, rebuilt his first carburetor, his face lighting up when the engine coughed to life. By midsummer, Miller's trade school had grown into something the whole town claimed pride in. Families brought food for the workers. Retired mechanics wandered in to share forgotten tricks. Donations of scrap steel, old parts, even cash quietly appeared at the garage door. John was no longer just a man trying to keep his head above water. He was a mentor, a leader, and, for the first time since the war, a man who knew exactly why he was still alive. One evening, as the sky bled purple and orange with sunset, John closed up the shop. Max leapt into the passenger seat of the Chevrolet, tail wagging in anticipation. John slid behind the wheel, the worn leather fitting him like an old glove. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life, steady and strong. He drove slowly out of town, past the cemetery where the name Caleb Rhodes was etched in stone, past the fields that stretched golden with late summer. The road opened before him, wide and endless. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth. He rolled down the window, letting the wind whip against his face, tug at his shirt. Max sat upright, head lifted high, ears sharp, his coat rippling like a banner. John spoke softly, his voice nearly lost to the hum of the road. "We found our way back, didn't we, boy? This isn't just a car, and it isn't just about me anymore. It's about life, about promises kept." He reached across, resting a hand on Max's back. "We've got a new road now." Max gave a low whine of contentment and wagged his tail, pressing closer. The Chevrolet surged forward, headlights cutting into the gathering dusk. Together, man and dog rolled into the horizon, not chasing escape this time, but embracing freedom, hope, and the promise of tomorrow. The story of John Miller and his loyal dog Max reminds us that broken things, whether rusted steel, weary hearts, or forgotten dreams, can be restored with patience, courage, and faith. What began as a veteran's quiet struggle became a fire that lit an entire community. A car once left to rot is now more than metal. It is a living symbol of promises kept, hope reborn, and lives reclaimed. In truth, perhaps this is how God works among us. Not always with thunder or lightning, but in the steady bark of a faithful dog, in neighbors who bring bread instead of judgment, in young hands eager to learn, in the courage of one man who chose not to quit. These are the small miracles that remind us heaven's light still shines even in our darkest corners. And so, let John's road be your reminder. Your scars do not end your story. They can become the very ink that writes your redemption. Share this tale if it touched you. Leave your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories of second chances. May God bless you and your family with peace, courage, and joy, today and always.